Guess let's get started, even though some people are still trickling in, naturally with this WebEx environment, we're going to have some late stragglers, but that's okay. Hello and welcome to the Global Primatology Virtual Conference, the first session of the final day, everybody, hosted by Central Washington University. My name is JP Calcitre, and I'll be moderating today's session. This session is with Doug Cress, and will last until 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Before we started this session, I wanted to let you know that this session will be recorded, and additionally, to make this a fun learning experience for everyone involved, I'm going to request that we follow a few rules. One mic and one voice, only one person speaks at a time, please. Respect all identities, including pronouns, nationalities, ethnic groups, etc. This is a safe space. Please don't feel discouraged, and all are welcome to engage and ask questions. Only one question, though. Out of respect for others' time, please just stick to asking one question. And also, please keep questions until the end of the session, unless it's for a matter of clarification. Only speak for yourself and no one else. Please no name calling or derogatory comments of any kind. You will be terminated from the session if you don't follow this rule. And keep the chat clear of traffic. Please only use it for specific purposes related to the talk. And now a little about our next presenter. Doug Cress has spent the last decade working on a host of environmental and conservation issues around the world. He has served as the executive director of the Pan-African Sanctuary Alliance, program director of the United Nations Great Apes Survival Partnership, chief executive officer of the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and vice president of the Ocean Conservancy. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Doug for his talk that we've all been waiting for.
Great. Thank you so much, JP. Thank you, Ashton, for inviting me for this conference. It's an honor to be with you. I do like the disclaimers you read at the front, JP. If the conversations have gotten that heated, this must be an important topic, an important series of presentations. But about this being a safe space, that's really true, because there's no question that anybody and everybody watching this presentation is smarter than me. So no chance will you be embarrassed in any way, shape, or form. But it is an honor to be with you today and to talk about great ape conservation, both in non-governmental organizations and governmental organizations. I've spent really more than 20 years now working in both sides of the fence in that area around great apes, but also around other species as well. And hopefully some of my journey can help some of you find ways forward, find opportunities, and understand the sort of rapidly changing field of conservation. Before I do, though, I just want to bring full circle how much this is really a return to the start for me. Roger and Debbie Fouts, who are pictured there on the screen, are certainly, for those of you who are in Ellensburg at Central Washington University, they are the foundation for which most of the primatology work has come out of the university. And it was in 1998. I'm living in Portland, Oregon now and then as well. And my wife and I went up to Ellensburg on a very snowy Saturday in December to a symposium they used to have when they had the Washoe Project there at Ellensburg. And I had no background at all in conservation or in apes or anything of the sort, but I was completely and totally moved off center by the presentations there, and understanding how in the middle of snow-swept Washington, you could have a center of conservation that had direct links back to a much bigger series of issues in Africa and globally, frankly. It really redefined for me how to come at an issue like conservation of any sort. At the time, I was a journalist. I was a reporter. I worked for the Washington Post, Time Magazine, other places. And I was really at the end. I was tired of being objective, which is what a reporter must do. You must get both sides of the story. I knew there was a side I wanted to be on. And I came to a point in my life where I wanted to fight for something I believed in, and things I cared about. And that first symposium I went to just gave me a bell went off, a light went off in my head. There is a way forward in this. And of course, I read Roger and Debbie's books and did so much more research about them. Eventually came to work with them a lot, and they're very good friends now. But that first day really did. I came home from Ellensburg back to Portland and was a changed person. I know a lot of the presentations today and also all week long have talked about populations. I think none of us probably have the same numbers, which is indicative of where great apes are in the world. But in terms of accuracy, in terms of changing landscapes, I'm going to just run through quickly some of the populations, not so much to give us a sense of the actual count, because that doesn't matter much. What really matters is the count is going down in almost every case. In almost every case, the great apes, our closest relatives on Earth, are in severe trouble. They are, all of them, endangered, some critically endangered, many of them a cough or a whisper away from being wiped off the map. Chimpanzees are the most populous, but you can see those numbers, which may look robust. 115,000 chimpanzees in Central Africa. If you have been to Central Africa, you can realize how strange those pockets of chimpanzees have become. And that's the case with all the great apes. Nigeria, Cameroon chimpanzees are in a very volatile border between two countries that don't always get along, and so on and so forth. Gorillas are no better. Populations of gorillas are even, again, 300,000 Western lowland gorillas seems like a tremendous number of of individuals, but that's not the case. They are incredibly fragile, and in their cases, quite often it's disease that is pushing in on them in addition to human development. I highlighted the mountain gorillas in yellow for one reason, and that's simply because it's the only population of great apes in the world on the rise. That has more than tripled since the early 1980s. And I'll talk more about that later, and the role conservation and the NGOs and NGOs play in that. But that's worth noting, that 1,000 is considered success. And in most cases, 1,000 would be too few to even care about. Orangutans, of course, are facing a whole different host of issues in Southeast Asia, not the least of which is they're only found on 2 islands, in Indonesia and Malaysia, and that's very limiting, but the development issues pressing on them, both in Sumatra and Borneo, have a devastating impact on their populations. And the fact that they are largely individual animals, not social and grouped like the African great apes, really makes it difficult to manage populations or to help populations survive and thrive. And of course, you've heard about bonobos some this week as well. Those numbers, again, are widely varying, but they are in only one country, in one small portion of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and are as fragile as any of the other species. Again, I just want to put those populations up there so that we had a general sense of numbers. It's going to take a tremendous effort to change those numbers. But I don't think focusing on numbers really is the way forward. I don't think population size is what we need to tackle at this point. It's not about adding 10 more individuals or 100 more individuals. Personally, I believe it's about a complete paradigm shift in how we approach conservation. For me, my conservation journey, really after that Ellensburg trip, 1 year later, I found myself in Southern Africa, in Zambia, and I had seen a television show about a sanctuary called the Chimfunshi Wildlife Orphanage, where this little old British couple was taking in orphan chimpanzees on their dairy farm. And I was completely blown away by the show. Put myself on a plane to Zambia, met the couple. They were wildly endearing, and at the time, they had about 86 chimpanzees. Within no time, it was over 100. They, for a period of time, were the largest chimpanzee sanctuary in the world. The lucky part was they had a huge dairy farm in which they could convert into chimpanzee enclosures, but they were quickly realizing that their ability to raise the funds necessary and to keep the sanctuary operating at the level it needed help. And this is where I began to find that my skills as a storyteller, as someone who was good at organization, at motivation, were able to be helpful to them. I came back and established Chimfunshi as a U.S. charity. I started raising funds for them, drove membership, visited a great deal. I became a trustee. And one of the upshots of that was I wrote a book about Chimfunshi called In My Family Tree, A Life with Chimpanzees. And actually, Roger Fouts gave one of the jacket blurbs for that book. But it was a way to sort of put down a marker that this story is worth keeping and worth telling. And we used that book to raise a tremendous amount of money off it through sales, but also through abilities to promote it and speak and get to media and so forth. And it's a pattern I repeated a number of times in my career, where you turn to the media and you turn to ways of exposing the work you're doing and tell that story. Because I came from the media, I had no fear of the media. I knew the media. I was the media. But I think that's an area where we need to do a lot better in conservation and science and research, because the media can be the world's greatest tool if you use it properly. If it gets to use you, it's the worst day of your life. And I think that's an important distinction. Shortly after joining Chimfunshi and getting a sense of the understanding of the primate community out there of researchers and leaders and so forth, I was named executive director of the Great Ape Project. And that was a whole different take on conservation. It was a US-based organization, and we really were focused out of a book called the Great Ape Project that came out in the late mid-1980s about the humanity of apes. And I don't even mean that in a sarcastic way. It was more about, they are so close to us, why are we treating them as lesser thans? And Great Ape Project really was focused on trying to win legal rights for great apes. We worked with Steve Wise in Boston, one of the leading attorneys in the world, really, on cross-species like legal issues. Also, Great Ape Project was allied with actually the Foutses and many others in the Chimpanzee Collaboratory. It was a program sponsored by the Glazer Foundation up there in Seattle. And one of our focuses there was to stop the use of chimpanzees and orangutans and any apes really in Hollywood. And there was a huge push for that. And we had Sarah Beckler, who was used to run the Chimpanzee Sanctuary Northwest, went undercover with animal trainers to expose how bad it was. We also worked on some more legal issues around great apes, and also tried to get great apes established as a World Heritage Species with the United Nations. That was a novel approach. We also published the Great Ape Project, again, going back to media, the first global captive census of great apes. In those days, stud books were poorly kept in zoos. Most of the sanctuaries that existed didn't really share or trust each other. Again, those issues of trust and collaboration. So we were able to pull all that information together in one place. And when it came out, when the book came out, Steve Wise, the attorney I mentioned before, said he was flipping through all the pages one after the other of all the names and all the birth dates and deaths and so forth. And he said it reminded him of reading slave logs from the 1600s and 1700s, where you just saw an endless list of names of illegally, often, certainly cruelly exported beings taken to a new country, a new world, and forever orphaned in a way. And that really hit home. I think that's what the book was intended to do, and it certainly did have a profound impact, I think, on the way we looked at captive issues. And that quickly led into, again, with sanctuaries, I was the director of the Pan-African Sanctuary Alliance. Again, collaboration was the issue. It just started out as one workshop. And the one workshop in Africa of the sanctuaries that cared for orphan chimpanzees and gorillas mostly didn't talk to each other, didn't trust each other, didn't even recognize each other as being from the same country. And we pulled them together at a workshop in Kenya. And by the time that workshop was over, they'd begun to sort of drop their defenses. But it was as we progressed over the next decade, they became each other's closest friends and allies. It's recognizing you have more in common and more to gain together than you do apart. And that's a recurring theme in so much of conservation and science, but it's a huge leap of trust and faith that has to go forward. It's difficult to do, but very quickly with PASA, we began to have annual management workshops for the sanctuary leaders, annual workshops for veterinarians, annual workshops for the educators and the keepers at different sanctuaries around the continent, so they would see each other's work and understand how they do this, I do that, oh, I can learn from you. It built up incredible trust and alliances among the sanctuaries. It also began to grow the organization, where it started off, I think, with 16 sanctuaries in 8 countries. It's now up to 26 sanctuaries in 13 countries. You've added in a lot of the monkeys and primate sanctuaries in other countries that were not necessarily great ape focused. We developed some new sanctuaries that were needed and began to get very strategic. We also really tried to raise the visibility of the work. When PASA was started in 2002, sanctuary was very much a dirty word. An animal that came out of the wild that had been orphaned, to the scientific world, to the academic world, it was dead. It had no value anymore. It was a dead end, and it had gone to a dead place to die. And that was really the mentality that the sanctuaries carried around, that they felt somehow shamed. And we had to flip that entirely, because what we really needed to say was, no, animals that came in from the wild bear every single indicator of what's happening in the wild. This is your best, freshest data you'll ever see in your life, right here in front of you. And it's literally in our hands. On top of that, we began to recognize the fact that these sanctuaries don't go away. The ones in Africa particularly are the longest running conservation programs on the continent. Most conservation projects, I don't care what you're focusing on or where you are, usually is good for 18 months to 24 months. The funding runs out and they move on. It has happened too often to count. I can tell you, I grew up in Africa and Asia. I've seen this firsthand, and I've certainly seen it in my professional career. But the sanctuaries don't go away because they don't have that luxury. They still have orphans to feed, and they still have work to do. But we began to focus increasingly on education and outreach, community engagement, buying locally sourced products so that the local farmers had a reason to support your work. And I'll talk to a little more about this later, but we also began to push reintroduction. The ones that could, the ones that had the capacity to get the primates that you are bringing in and get them back out into the wild. Sometimes it took a decade to get to that point. Sometimes it was faster. But as I'll talk about later, reintroduction had a tremendous upside to it. That was something that really made the sanctuaries a fluid piece of the conservation puzzle. At the same time as I was doing Africa, I was also working in Asian issues with the Orangutan Conservancy, where I was vice president. Again, a lot of the work there was about visibility and grants. Using the model we'd already developed with PASA, we started establishing veterinary workshops because the vets weren't talking to each other and didn't really know each other. That was a huge success, especially because the vets, as with Africa, you're building up national capacity. We weren't bringing in 400 veterinarians from, Iowa or something. We were bringing in veterinarians from Indonesia and Malaysia and other countries in Southeast Asia, Thailand, and so forth, to learn from each other. And that was really key. We would have facilitators and leaders from major institutions around the world, but we really wanted to impart that wisdom to local veterinarians. And it's been a huge success. They still go on to this day, those workshops every year. But like anything, collaboration was the key. Every single orangutan conservation project or sanctuary, all of which, just like in Africa, were bursting at the seams with too many orphans and so forth, they didn't trust each other. Every single one of them had fought each other, sued each other, slept with each other, married each other, divorced each other. I've never seen such a witch's brew of personalities. All good people, but they really had to find a way to get to a place of safety and mutual trust. And a lot of what we did at Orangutan Conservancy was built around trying to get those projects to play nicely with each other. When I left both PASA and Orangutan Conservancy at the same time to join the United Nations, where I was a program director at the United Nations Environment Program in Kenya for almost 7 years. I worked there. One of my jobs there was to run the Great Apes Survival Partnership, which is the only species conservation program the UN has ever set up, and probably ever will set up. But it was a very specific attempt to see if you could use species as a way to drive conservation focus and to marshal sort of a global support. It was built around the Declaration on Great Apes, which a number of us helped to write in the early 2000s, was signed in 2005. And it was a unique partnership in the United Nations because it was not just, most UN programs are simply the countries, or the member states as they call them, or parties. It wasn't just Rwanda and Kenya and Indonesia, but it also had NGOs like Born Free Foundation or World Wildlife Fund. It also had corporations. It also had a variety of other partners, all of whom had an equal vote, which is really unique among the United Nations. Usually all the NGOs and conservation groups and outsiders can do is lobby, and then the country can vote, often in secret, how it wants to. But within GRASP, that was not the case. Within GRASP, they all voted equally, and they had to establish their own sort of alliances to do anything. There's only 23 countries in the world that have great apes, but there were over 50 countries in GRASP because France was a member and the United States was a member and so forth. But by the time we had over 120 members, even the countries all voting the same wouldn't win any certain debate. They had to have the support of some NGOs or other groups or other other international governmental organizations like CITES or UNESCO or somebody like that. So it really became a much more interesting web of conservation and political building that I've ever seen. The time at GRASP and the time at the United Nations was pretty exciting because we were just getting around to the issues of sustainable development, the sustainable development goals, and again, how you could use iconic species to move some of these discussions forward. I want to mention two things quickly, though, about the time there. I said we were trying to, I think, being novel and trying to think of different ways to do things was important. One thing we found quickly was that we could use the United Nations peacekeepers that were stationed all across Africa to move orphan great apes from one place to another. If you have rescued a chimpanzee in Burundi and you need to get it to a sanctuary in eastern DR Congo, it's not easy to do. But the UN peacekeepers moved across those borders quite easily. And they were all, once they were convinced it was a good thing to do, they were all too happy to help. I like this one picture, though, because when we were telling we wanted to move a chimpanzee, they had this vision of King Kong getting into the back of that Hercules plane behind them. And they were terrified that the ape would break out and the plane would explode in midair or something. And you can see how big the chimpanzee is compared to any of those people. It's quite young. The cage is too big in some ways for that chimpanzee. What is funny is that they all wanted to be photographed taking it off the plane. So we put the chimpanzee back on the plane about 50 times so they all could be at the front and get that picture as they're carrying him off. Once they did the first couple of those moves, they would call us asking if there were any other moves to be done anytime soon. And they were a huge help. And it was a great way to use a piece of the United Nations. Their mandate was to protect the culture of the African countries they worked in. And we were able to define great apes as part of that culture. One other thing we did at the United Nations was we built an app called the Ape app, and it won a lot of awards for ingenuity and novelty and so forth. It was really built around our program at GRASP and how we could use what was an early version of sort of that mobile technology and so forth to promote the work. But what we found was really useful about it was in Uganda, for instance, where there's a lot of issues with human-wildlife conflict in some of the forest regions where school kids would run into chimpanzees and so forth, and it would be a bad mix. We had sounds on the app of what the calls of chimpanzees sounded like or orangutans sounded like and so forth. Teachers were using the app to teach their kids what chimpanzees sounded like, so to avoid those areas. I mean, it became a life-saving tool in some ways. It reduced the conflict that would have happened otherwise. It was never intended for that, but it worked well for that. And it was one of those happy accidents where by thinking of something different, by finding ways to use the tools we had a better result. I mentioned a moment ago that being at the UN, sustainable development was becoming an issue in a fast-paced way. And I think for the last 2 or 3 years I was at the UN, all we did really was talk about issues around great apes, less the great apes. Palm oil and forestry and mining and oil and gas and so many of the development issues were what we began to focus on more because those were the drivers now impacting the conservation efforts we had. It really was important that we began to listen to palm oil developers or listen to forestry and logging companies and understand what their concerns were and how we could work with them. You know, drawing hard lines, first of all, it's not the United Nations way, but second of all, it's not a very useful way. It's not diplomatic. And if you drew a hard line and demonized one side or one country, you were going to get nowhere. We had to listen and find ways to reroute roads, to alter mining programs, to get better environmental impact assessments for oil and gas development and so forth. I'll talk a little more about some of these issues in a moment, but that really became something that drove a lot of our work. And that picture of me is talking at the round table on sustainable palm oil meeting one year in Southeast Asia. There was nobody in that room but me that knew what an ape was, but everybody in that room knew what palm oil was. And it was key to get into their world and speak to them on their turf. And I think that's something that's important to do in conservation. You've got to move out of the safe areas. One other thing at the UN we could do was produce reports that addressed issues that were fast emerging. The United Nations has something called rapid response assessments. It's a report that's done in 3 months as a snapshot of the world today. How do we address it? How do we move forward? Just a few of the ones we did. Stolen apes, for instance, was the first report ever about the illegal trade in great apes. And what we found was that over 90% of all the confiscations are never reported because they're not crossing international borders. So the illegal trade was huge. It was massive, and it was devastating wild populations. And certainly if you knew the sanctuary world, you could see that they were just being stuffed with confiscated ape. But because so few were winding up in Paris or someplace like that, they weren't registering in the CITES databases or the World Customs Organization databases. So that was a new chapter. Talking about sustainable forestry, it's great on paper when we found out in that report that any of the financial benefit from sustainable forestry that came to the grounds, to the actual frontline communities, was almost barely registered. Then you begun to understand why sustainable forestry was not as practical as it would seem on paper, and that had to change. And of course, palm oil has so many issues around it. I'll talk in a minute about why it's not going away. But what we came to realize very quickly is there's no shortage of certified sustainable palm oil. It's easy to make, and it's certainly out there. There's no market for it. The consumer is not demanding that. And until the consumer does demand that, it's going to lay somewhere lost in the middle. And the final post I had really that dealt with apes in any significant way was running the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums. The potential there is massive. 10% of the world's population visits a zoo or aquarium every year. 10%. You know, we're 7.5 gazillion people on Earth now, and that's a lot of people walking and paying often to walk into your world. You have them captive, as it were, and you should be able to change their minds and their behavior. Trying to get the zoos and aquariums to focus more on conservation, more on sustainable development. That's the trick, and it was one of the real hard pushes I was making when I worked there. Also, to play a more engaged role in illegal trade, because quite often confiscations came to zoos. You know, when this government confiscated, we just drop it at the nearest zoo. So they had to play a greater role in helping enforce and respond to illegal trade, and also pushing the zoos and aquariums to develop better ethical practices, whether it was with palm oil or with RSPO or with sustainable forestry, with Forestry Stewardship Council, single-use plastic. So many of the MOUs we signed in the time I was at WAZA were built around deadlines to get the zoos and aquariums to change their practices. And as I say, anybody attending this particular presentation today, your passion is probably conservation. Your passion may be great apes. Your passion may be any number of the issues impacting great apes. It's tricky. The field is changing almost daily. It certainly has changed in the 20 years I've been doing it. And a number of the indicators are pretty clear to see. Top down is out. The UN, the World Wildlife Fund, nobody can wag a finger and tell a country what to do anymore. And you certainly can't tell a community what to do anymore. There has to be a collaborative, supportive way forward. And the end result is going to be that we as North Americans or any outside country is not going, the objective is not to have you do the job. It's to train and help and support somebody from the country to do the job. That picture there of all those veterinarians working on that orangutan, every single one of them is Malay. And that is key because they should be the ones taking care of orangutans. I know many people's goal in life is to hold, and I mean this certainly with all due respect, is to hold a chimpanzee or feed a chimpanzee or to hold a gorilla or just to be near them, be in them. That time may have passed. And I think we need to be able to recognize that and accept that. Also, we have to understand that conservation has to play a role in the economy. It's not a moral obligation anymore. Conservation has to pay for itself. It has to be able to pencil out in terms of the economy. There are a lot of examples of that, some I'll get to in a moment, but it simply isn't a gift. It's not charity. As I mentioned before, there are not many options anymore for Europeans and North Americans to play a hands-on role in terms of conservation. Certainly there are for research and data collection, but even there, you're quite often asked to train or work with a local organization or local individuals or students. So the image that Jane Goodall used to have of going out with the binoculars and a cup of tea in the morning is long, long, long gone. And I think that's probably healthy. I think it was not necessarily a model that's going to take us forward very far, but it certainly is something that, if this is your life's passion and you're a student, you need to be clear this may be how it looks to you. At the UN, we call these South-South solutions, and that really is kind of a little misleading, South being below the equator. And the general sense was that anything below the equator was less developed. Everything above the equator was the top down. It's a little out of whack because China is always included in South-South solutions, and they're frankly above the equator. But it really is trying to find a way that the countries that are behind the development curve can find their own solutions or help each other find them. And I think that is going to be a model we see for at least the next 2 or 3 decades. But I would say that this next 2 or 3 decades are going to be the last two or three decades we have to get these things right. It may be just a decade. Most every major agreement right now, whether it's the Paris Climate Accords or the Sustainable Development Goals or any of the big international agreements, are shooting for 2030. And this is the decade we're in. 2030 is the deadline. So we don't have the luxury of time to do this slowly and to wait for a great deal of consensus. We need good ideas, good data, good science, and good action now. So in many ways, conservation careers, you're in the right place at the right time. This is exciting times, I think. And what is necessary right now for anybody who's a student, but anybody also who is just starting into these fields, is to begin to network and to build your associations and to understand the integration between disciplines, organizations, countries, how they work together. I've heard a lot on these presentations about mentors, particularly in academics. Mentors work in every single field. I'm happy to mentor anybody that wants some help getting a leg up. It's important. People were very kind to me coming forward. As I said, I'm not the smartest person in this room. The only degree I have is in modern Native American history from Montana State University. But because people were kind to me and were helpful to me and gave me a sense of value in the fields where I entered, it's worked out for me, and I'm certainly happy to pay that forward. I think that is an important part. It's an obligation, as Dr. Graham said yesterday. It's an obligation we have going forward. One of the best ways to do that, and I'll have some links at the end, is internships. Rather than put all your chips in right now on the career you want, test a bunch of them. It's a buffet, 2 and 3 months here, there, and everywhere else can give you a sense of where you fit in best. And I think it's important, too, that we understand that just like no sanctuary on Earth or needs you to go give a banana to a chimpanzee, that's just not the job for you. They have plenty of local staff to do that. There are fields that feel a step back maybe from some of these conservation issues, but that's where the help is needed most. That could be law, that could be government, it could be fundraising, it certainly can be communications, it can be technology. So sometimes you may not even really have that much affinity for a chimpanzee or a bonobo, but your ability to understand the law or your ability to raise funds could be the difference. And I think that's an important area, important distinction to be clear on. So as we move into this 2020 and up decade, where so much of the world gets decided in terms of climate change, for instance, what are the threats to great apes? If I'd asked this question, or if I put this list up 20 years ago, it would not look like this. These threats, almost all of them, did not exist. But nowadays, and it's certainly impossible not to believe it, disease is probably the biggest threat any of the great apes have. You saw those numbers of populations. They look big. So many are fractured populations that are unable to link up with one another, and a simple disease could wipe them out. We're dealing with COVID, and the effect of COVID on great apes is still an evolving evolving study, really. But there's no question that Ebola and anthrax and Marburg and so many other diseases that have a devastating effect on great apes. And we need to be clear that any of these pandemics coming out poses a risk to them as well. Certainly habitat loss, which goes with human population on that list, is a big one. That image of the chimpanzee running through the village carrying, looks like fruit perhaps, happens all the time. A human-wildlife conflict as the population grows and pushes into forests is a big one. And we drive a lot of that ourselves. At the UN, we often dealt with the refugee crisis, and refugees usually went into national parks and forests like that to get away from human conflict. Most national parks around the world are not fenced. It's not like there's a line between this is national park and this is not. So refugee and migrant populations, which are moving across Africa and Asia all the time, move right through the natural habitat of great apes, and there's a devastating impact. And they carry every disease and every possible malady that humans have that can impact great apes. And all of this really adds up to climate change. As the forests begin to shift, as we take down more, as the temperature rises, as the seas rise, a lot of what would be or would have been traditional great ape habitat is very vulnerable now. And we need to be clear that these are very fast moving and shifting drivers that impact in on great ape populations. And I've talked before at that 2030 deadline, but it's real. 2030 is absolutely when the clock is going to ring, and we need to have done much more than we are on pace to do. We need to have changed the way we act and the way we work to have the positive impacts and positive results we need by 2030. By the way, if I'm getting too Dougie Downer and this is all heavy stuff, it's just the reality of it. But I'm not a person who's lost hope. I think we can get these things right. And I think so because these new threats require new solutions. And what I like is that human beings are constantly working on new ways forward. We do have to think different. We have to act different. We need to develop new skills, new ways of solving problems. The old joke about committing the same act over and over again, hoping for a different solution is the definition of insanity. Well, that's what this would be. If we keep doing the exact same things we've done, we're going to get the same results, and they're not good enough. We have done nothing largely for the last 50 years, but count less of a species, less of habitat, less. We're trying to slow the rate of loss rather than turn it around. And what we need to focus more on, because most old solutions came at the expense usually of human beings. In other words, you must give up this land, you must stop what you're doing, human beings don't work so good when we have things taken away. We need to develop win-win scenarios. Most of those are built around economy, job creation, and a sense of investment in a project. And I think that's where conservation has been slow, but is catching up to understand that built-in sense of obligation. I have a few sort of case examples of how fast things have changed, and I just wanted to highlight these for a second. I mentioned before that reintroduction is something we started to do at the Pan-African Sanctuary Alliance. And reintroduction really is the putting back into the wild populations or the wild habitat, actual habitat, of formerly captive great apes at sanctuaries. There are a tremendous number of things that have to happen first for a reintroduction to be even actualized or be successful. It's very difficult. It's very political. It's very expensive. It takes up to a decade or more to get apes in the right place. It requires all kinds of physical and emotional assessments. But it does work. And I've seen it work in Africa, and I've seen it work in Asia. And it is something that increasingly, I think, sanctuaries and rescue and rehab centers focus on. First of all, they can't keep that many captive animals without just going under. It's too expensive. It's too difficult. There's not enough space. It's not healthy. And in cases of orangutans, for instance, which are largely solitary animals, you can't have 700 in a sanctuary and in Borneo and consider that to be a viable way forward. You need to find a way to put them back in the forest. The forests are there. Again, forests are not fenced. That's not something that's not a positive there. But forests are reality, and that is good. One thing putting apes back into forests does is it makes forests healthy again. It puts great apes back where they belong, near the top of whatever kind of a pyramid or a species plan you have. But great apes change the way forests behave. They open them up. They bring in sunlight. They nurture forests. Forests get healthy and grow naturally again. Other species return almost immediately. That is something that is a happy byproduct, and I don't think any of us ever counted on. But when bonobos began going back into the wild through the reintroduction program, you started seeing leopards back in the area for the first time in decades. And leopards, of course, would be a predator for bonobos, but they were moving along sort of that tractor beam of species. When chimpanzees went back into Congo in that reintroduction program, forest elephants started coming back. In fact, so many forest elephants came back into the areas that it became dangerous for the trackers to follow the chimpanzees as part of the sort of follow-up assessment programs, and so on and so on and so on. There's never been a case of reintroduction where other species didn't pull into the slipstream. The other good thing about it is because reintroduction requires such a long post-release monitoring assessment protocol, there's a tremendous number of opportunities for job creation among local communities and community engagement in supporting these projects. And that goes from science all the way through rangers. And it protects the environment as well. So you have begun to build in a protective layer around the forest that is the result of these reintroduction projects. It's not easy. Again, it's very, very hard, and it requires tremendous skill to understand which of the primates are strong enough and fit enough to be able to handle a reintroduction project. You can't just turn 20 loose and hope for the best. There really is a selection process. One thing that did surprise me, though, was the emotional connection most sanctuary managers had to the ape they'd spent a decade caring for. One of them said in Guinea, when they took the chimpanzees out of the forest in the cages and they pulled open the doors, kind of like you see in that picture with an orangutan, all the chimpanzees scampered off in the forest and disappeared. And the keepers and the caretakers were all crushed. They thought they would at least have a moment of kind of thank you, but no, they just disappeared, which is the way it should be. But that human emotion, that emotional connection was something that surprised at least me. Ecotourism is something I've heard mentioned on several of the presentations, and it's a tricky one, really tricky, because it has such an upside and such a dangerous downside. But it's hard to argue with what it really is called extreme conservation, what it's done for mountain gorillas, for instance. Those first three numbers up there on the screen, that's what a daily permit costs in those countries to spend 1 hour in the company of a gorilla, like in that picture there. For that 1 hour, the gorilla knows it's going to be annoyed to have somebody nearby, but they don't get too ruffled about it. But that's a staggering amount of money, and that's just the permit. That's not the plane trip over, that's not the lodge you stay in, that's not the equipment you bought, and that's also not the how many hours it takes sometimes to find them. It's gotten easier with GPS and so forth and cell phones, but the first times I ever went to see a gorilla back in the 1980s, you had to hike in the mountains till you cut their trail and then follow the trail. I mean, that could take many hours. And the last time I went, one of the last times, I think it took us 3 hours, and it was some straight up and down hiking. I mean, hand over fist up the side of a mountain. But it's worth it. In Rwanda, tourism is 15.1% of the GDP. Okay, that is not a number you can look away from. And that's why Rwanda treats gorillas as if they are gods. It's risen to a level there that is incredible. What is nice about it as well is the three countries in East Africa that have mountain gorillas, knowing that they move around between borders, they share the income from the gorilla trekking programs. There's a lot of community engagement, as I mentioned, tremendous job creation, tremendous income coming into there from that projects. Again, it does have risks. It's not something you can easily duplicate. Many tour companies go to East Africa and look at the mountain gorilla projects and figure, why can't we do that? It's difficult because most apes really don't have the patience to sit around and have people stare at them. And it can be dangerous for your clients. They could get injured. And that's really close in that picture to that gorilla. But if a chimpanzee decided it had enough of you, it can be a very bad situation. And yet through all of this, this is exactly why mountain gorillas are on the rise. They almost have too many mountain gorillas now for the small amount of mountain space they have in East Africa. That's a good problem to have, and it's a unique problem. But all of these projects require such oversight and such clear management. Those are vital issues. So simply to start up a chimpanzee trekking program someplace without a great deal of thought and investment is difficult. But it's hard to argue with the results. It really is. And I have never, ever been on a gorilla trek and not have everybody happy. They all are blown away by the situation. And if you ever get a chance, any of you, to do it, it's a thrill of a lifetime. It really is. I mentioned before about palm oil, and we could have presentations. We could have a whole seminar on palm oil. I just wanted to say quickly, not that it's a surprise to anybody, but it's not going away. It's not. It's in half of all the products you buy at the grocery store, see at the grocery store. It was never really an Asian problem or an Asian issue. It was always global. It certainly has had a tremendous impact on Asian economies and Asian landscapes and so forth. It's now becoming the same sort of a driver in Africa. That picture there could easily have been rainforest that is now nothing but forest palms. And if you go to Indonesia or Malaysia or any number of countries in Southeast Asia, you can drive for hours among nothing but plantations like that of palm oil palms. As I said, though, it is no good to simply demonize a product. You can boycott all you want, but I personally find boycotts become dark and sad and very, very negative. They don't seem to get a solution, and we're going to have to do better. Palm oil is a good example of that. I mentioned before that we worked a lot with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil at several places I worked. There are also national palm oil certification programs in many of the countries that develop it. Certified sustainable does exist. It certainly can be created, and the big companies do. Simply comes down to public demand. And I think this is a great example of where if you were someone that was invested in ape issues, if you chose to focus on the certified sustainable aspects of palm oil or cacao or coffee or sugar, any one of a number of products, you could have a tremendous impact in a good way on great apes and their habitats by driving the way consumers ask for products and driving behavior change. It really is important, and it is something that simply you cannot go to war with corporations this large. They have way, way, way too much invested to back out now, but they can change, and quite often they need to be told how to change. But it is essential, and it is something I think that many really smart people can focus on and have a positive impact. And don't forget zoos and aquariums. They're right there. They're the closest thing at hand for most of us. As I mentioned before, we were really pushing when I ran the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums to get zoos and aquariums to be leaders in terms of the sourcing and the use of materials, whether it's single-use plastic or palm oil or certified lumber, that they could set clear examples. This picture's from the Oakland Zoo, which has gone entirely plastic-free now. Many of the aquariums in this country have eliminated single-use plastic because plastic in the ocean is one of the biggest threats to marine conservation and marine species that there is. They also have some issues about ethical acquisition of animals, and we're always working to change that, but I think most zoos and aquariums are understanding the impact they could have. It's important to understand there's over 15,000 zoos and aquariums in the world, and they have a tremendous ability to change the way a local community behaves. But I think we need to start thinking, at least in zoos and aquariums, about not simply being a collection of animals. I know at the bigger level they do have these thoughts. But it may come to a time where the Woodland Park Zoo only works on elephant conservation and converts its entire footprint there, or focuses primarily on something like elephant breeding and elephant conservation in order to support wild conservation projects. So many times a zoo will have a bonobo is born or a gorilla is born, and they say it's a huge conservation success. Well, no, it's not really. You've kept another captive animal in a captive situation, and that's fine. You've kept a stud book alive, and a species fluidity is good, but there is no question that animal is not going back. A zoo animal is not going back to the wild anytime soon, especially not one that is captive born. So that's not necessarily conservation in a traditional sense. So finding a new way forward, perhaps, with zoos and aquariums in how they work with frontline conservation is going to be important. It's an evolution, and zoos and aquariums are businesses at the end of the day, so it's a bit tricky. But I think you're seeing smarter people beginning to understand that their role is evolving. So I'm getting near the end of my speaking time, and I just wanted to circle back around to some of the possibilities out there. Again, there's NGOs, which are non-governmental organizations, and there's GOs or IGOs, governmental organizations. I would say I'm a big believer in internships, especially when you're first getting out of school, because who knows what you want to do with your life. I've been through about 80 careers, and I'm still working on them. But there are many internships out there, and there's a lot of them listed right here, that can be real eye-openers. That picture is actually the main drive up at the UN headquarters in Nairobi, where I worked for many years. And I always had at least 2 or 3 interns on staff all the time I was there, and they were vital to me. UN internships go from 2 to 6 months, and I wanted everything. I would have Chinese interns, I would have American interns, whatever, based on the work we were doing at the time. And it's a great way to go forward. And you don't have to be at the environment program. You could wind up in New York at the General Assembly. You could be at UNESCO in Paris. There's a million different ways you can get engaged as an intern and still impact these issues of conservation and great apes. And then from the domestic side, the same thing with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's the organization that supplies a lot of the funding that really does the on-ground work there in Congo or Guinea or Sierra Leone. And being a part of that organization can be a real plus. There's some more up there that are more traditional, Woodland Park Zoo or Animal Legal Defense Fund, but it's a great way to get started. And if anybody wants to follow up with me afterwards by email or so forth, I can point you in better directions. There's a list that goes on to several hundred organizations that have internships, but it might be a good way to get your feet wet. I would also say that there's a lot of opportunities where I mentioned networking earlier. Sometimes simply being in the room can open up possibilities and ideas you hadn't thought of. There have been some of the presentations already from sanctuaries here in the United States, but there's many other opportunities where you can work with great apes or conservation issues. A great one, and one of the best I think, is the Zoos and Aquariums Committed to Conservation. It's called ZAC, and they have a conference every 2 years. And the ZAC conference I've attended many years and spoken at many years. Right now, of course, all things seem to be virtual, but to be engaged when we get back to being in a room together, I would say put a ZAC conference on your schedule, because it's a great way to meet people who are doing the frontline work as well as the zoos and aquariums that support them. And it's a real nice crucible right there of work. Also, the American Association of Zookeepers. You've got one at every single zoo in the country. You've got one in Seattle and so forth, one here in Portland. They are always looking for help for doing fundraisers and projects and implementation projects. So reach out to them and see what possibilities there are. Also based here in Portland, Oregon is the Pan-African Sanctuary Alliance, which I used to run. It's still based here in Portland. Again, they may need help in a number of ways, but they can also hook you up with all of the sanctuaries in Africa. And just like there's the African sanctuaries, there's the North American Primate Sanctuary Alliance, which is all the captive chimpanzee and orangutan and other sanctuaries, monkeys as well, in this country, many of which have gone through very difficult lives, whether it was lab experiments or it was Hollywood or any number of ways that we find to use and abuse our closest relatives. So again, any questions on those, or if you want more opportunities, just reach out to me afterwards. Happy to help. And I believe that's where my presentation ends. So that's my email. I'm happy to hear from anybody. And I'm here on the West Coast and always willing to talk as well. So please do reach out. But thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was a really great talk. We're going to do questions now. So you can use the raise your hand function, which is just the little hand next to your name under participants if you want to speak to Doug directly over your video chat, or you could just put it into the chat and I could direct the question to Doug if you don't feel particularly comfortable talking on camera. Ashton, you have your hand up.
Hey, Doug, I thought I would just go ahead and start us off. You've had quite a myriad of opportunities and experiences, and coming from a background that is not particularly in this field of primatology, I was just wondering how you really, I mean, I know you talked about your background, but how you really went about finding these opportunities and really making your own path within this field, because it can be so hard to even just get a start.
Yeah, my resume looks like the witness relocation program. I'm aware of that. It's but I am fairly high energy, and I'm always interested in the next thing. I'm just the way I am. It's hardwiring. I find, honestly, my journalism background helps because it taught me just to start talking to people. You interview people, you ask questions, you get past the intimidation or the fear because it's how you start a conversation. But I've also found that everything I ever did in life fed into the next career, whatever it was. I was pulling along skills. If you've learned to write on deadline, then you can produce under pressure. And that's what a lot of conservation is. Can you get this done on time, on budget? You know, can you make that hire? Can you make that decision? I think, again, a lot of the personalities, they can be prickly. You know, this is no different than probably in other fields. We have some big, strong personalities and egos in conservation, and getting past that and getting past the intimidation of that is important. There's no magic pill. You just have to. But I think what I found primarily was that people were kind and they were nice to me. And I think that's a huge difference. They let me walk into rooms and listen and learn. And I learned on the job in many cases, but anybody can. And that's what's key. I don't think that necessarily you come out of a program, a university program or a training program fully formed. Yeah, I think you have some ideas, but you've got to come out and test them in the real world. And some things won't work, and some things will fail miserably, but you learn not to do it again, and you'll begin to sort of develop your skill sets. And I think that's really one of the keys too. That and learning that, ironically, here we are trying to save species most like us, and yet our own species can't seem to get along half the time. That's something we have to just do better at. But it's patience. The UN had diplomatic training, and boy, that's a good thing to learn, because it's listening and listening for the overlap. And the overlap is where this side and this side each want something that's the same. And when you find that, now I've got you. Okay, now we can work with this. And that's just one of those skills that, again, you can develop. It's hard work, but it's good to have all those kind of skills.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
So in the chat, we have a question from Dit. What would you say some of the most effective ways that zoos can collaborate with in situ projects other than financial?
Okay, there's a couple of things there. And I hear you. On their best day, most zoos, with the exception of the Bronx Zoo, most zoos don't have the financial clout to really change the game. They just don't. But the Bronx Zoo is affiliated with the Wildlife Conservation Society, WCS, and that's one of the biggest funders in the world. So it's kind of a real nice plus one. There's two things they can do, and this is going to sound like I'm just doubling back on what I said before. Zoos can primarily tell the story from, use their species as telling the story of what's happening in the real world, as if they're ambassadors. And that's an old trick. But they need to then put the zoo goer, the visitor, through some kind of behavior change. By doing this, you've committed now not to purchase this product anymore, or you've agreed to only purchase this kind of product, or you will write a letter to an assemblyman to have a change. I mean, it's an act, and when the act is asked, it does make the conservation impact greater. I also think, though, that sometimes the biggest thing they can do is send a keeper overseas, not because the keeper has to go feed a gorilla. It doesn't work that way. But very often a keeper comes back as a zealot, and they suddenly are the transformational force that makes that zoo change the way it thinks, gets other keepers engaged, and so forth. There's that. I've seen that happen time and again. And the zoo that doesn't invest in its staff that way is asking for a very short-sighted staff. And it works both ways. Sometimes if you ally yourself with a sanctuary, for instance, bringing one of their caretakers over and giving them a chance to see how you do it at a zoo is helpful. And also exchanging materials. We used to, at PASA, collect secondhand keeper uniforms, as keepers would cycle out of their uniforms, and send those over to the sanctuaries because they didn't have uniforms. So we would, let's say, Oregon Zoo would give us a whole bunch of secondhand uniforms that were still in very good shape. We'd put a PASA badge on it, sew-on badge. It would still have the Oregon Zoo badge over here. And Oregon Zoo's getting free advertising, really, in maybe Uganda or someplace. And the staff there is feeling like it's empowered and respected. And those little things can make a huge difference.
So we have Amanda with her hand up. I'll let her talk, and then there's a question in the chat after that.
Hi, this has been such an amazing talk. Thank you so much.
Huh.
I'm interested in studying the anthropology of conservation, specifically with zoos. I started out studying primates, and now I'm realizing you can't save the primates unless you work with the people. I was curious if it would be encouraging as I progress through school to start engaging with the AZA now and ZAC now. And I don't know. It's a vague question.
No, I think it's a great question, and it's a great take on it. Exactly, that's what I like, is you turned it on its head. You went 180 on the issue. Rather than studying the apes, you said let's go back door and figure another way in. I think AZA is great. Dan Ash is a very good friend, and they do an amazing job. I think you might have greater success with the conservation aspect if you went to ZAC first, because it's exactly who you're trying to get to. I think you would finally get there from AZA. I mean, they're affiliated with each other. It's not like they're not enemies or anything. They're brother and sister. But I think ZAC is a great place to start. And if you want to email me later, I can give you some contacts at ZAC, or you can go to the website and find them that way. But I think there's no question that the anthropology of this is important. It's there's never been a conservation project that didn't start with somebody's force of will. It's a person or some persons who got inspired. And once that happens, it just begins to blow out. It just simply can't be generated by anything less than the human spirit. It doesn't work when it's political and ground out of a machine. It doesn't work. And that's what I think you find in ZAC and most of the zoos. They have those people who are zealots, and they are change makers.
Thank you so much.
Vithra asks, what do you think the future of palm oil is?
To be honest, I do wish it would go away. We don't need it. We don't need it in anything. 90% of the things we use it for are just to make something shiny. It's shiny house paint, it's shiny lipstick, it's shiny dog food. It's just the glistening thing. It doesn't have taste. It's the future, though, unfortunately, is going to be here. There's no way in this decade of change we're supposed to be on, it's going to go away. I do think, though, I have belief that we can make the certified sustainable option the dominant option. You know, I was driving through Indonesia one day in Sumatra with this guy, and he was driving a car, and we're just going through, I mean, literally hours of just palm, palm, palm like this. And he goes, my village was there. And he knew exactly where his village had been. It looked to me no different than any place else. But like so many villages, the leaders sold out, sold to an oil palm company. The village was taken away and rebuilt. And the weird thing he said was, it's about 5 to 10 degrees hotter here now than it used to be when he grew up, because there's no heavy forest canopy to keep the cool in. That's not sustainable, okay? That's the sort of climate change, and I mean that in two separate words, that will drive an island into the sea. I mean, that's not good. And I think we will exhaust the ability to continue to expand oil palm soon enough. I just hope it's not by the time we've destroyed the temperatures and so forth. I do wish it would go away, but it's not. We're gonna have to work with it and push for the certified sustainable options.
Marilyn asks, the ability of accredited zoos to be drivers for change / modeling behaviors / education / to tell the stories seems to be connected to them having collections. That's what brings in those guests. If zoos move to species-specific conservation centers, would they not lose their ability to make those important connections?
Great question. You know, and we were just having these conversations, just starting them. You know, it used to be the zoos always were portrayed as an arc, 2 and 2 and 2 and 2, and it was the last chance for a species, you know, to get on board and so forth. But you're seeing that change. When I say that an entire zoo would turn itself inside out to become the pygmy hippo breeding center, you know, that's probably not going to happen in my lifetime, and I plan to live a long time. But to start to think that way is important. And I think it's how you sell it, though. You know, zoos seem all too happy to say that every single birth is a conservation success. Well, let's prove it. Okay, let's see you really do commit yourself over. Oakland Zoo, it just pops into mind again, has a tremendous program where they're putting a lot of the northern species in northern United States back into the wild. It's nothing to do with them. I mean, Oakland is 1 million miles from, I think they're in Montana and North Dakota and some places up there. But they felt it was the right thing to do, and they found a way forward, and working with Native American nations up there as well. You know, you can get outside your borders, and you can make it clear that the work you're doing here can have an impact there. It needn't be quite so contained, I guess I'd say, but it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. The irony of all this, though, is all of the zoos and aquariums, particularly the ones inside AZA or WAZA or whatever, the animals you ever saw on display as part of the collection is a fraction of the ones they actually care for. So much is behind closed doors, the back of house, that are rescue animals. Even SeaWorld, which I know everybody takes wild swings at, has one of the largest marine rescue and recovery programs off-site that you'd ever imagine. And they never did publicize that enough. That made me crazy in the times I worked with zoos and aquariums. I'd say, you should be out there beating a drum as to what you're really doing. Instead, you're fighting about whether you have a killer whale show. Tell about what you're really doing over here. If you go to the Oregon Zoo, which is the one right here in Portland, there's a little train you can ride around. And as you ride the train back into the zoo, you go past all of the injured birds enclosures they have there. And there's a tremendous number of them. But they don't publicize that, and they're not on view to the people. So I think zoos and aquariums are kind of their own worst enemies. They feel guilty about keeping captive animals, but don't talk about the good work they do sometimes enough. But they still need to change. There's no doubt. They can't stay where they are. And you've seen during this pandemic how economically vulnerable many of them are. Many have come very close to closing.
Here's another one. Amy asks, are there particular initiatives in place to team up with large companies to promote sustainable palm oil, especially those that have a bad reputation that may want to improve their public relation in this area?
There's a lot of initiatives. They're kind of hard to pull apart sometimes. When I was running the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the man at the time who ran the roundtable on sustainable palm oil, Daryl Weber, was a very good friend of mine, and we were members of RSPO as WAZA. And one morning he called me and said, Nestle, Nestle, the chocolate corporation, is not filing its annual reports. They're being negligent. We have to throw them out. But I don't want Nestle out of RSPO. They're too big to have out. We need to keep them in, but I have to throw them out. So what I want you to do, if you could, is scare them. And I thought, what's he talking about? So we worked out a plan where, because Nestle was being negligent and not abiding by the rules of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, we ordered all of the WAZA members to take down the Nestle products from their stores that they sold, and take them off. Don't sell Nestle products anymore. And we had that covered by local news, and that was in Australia, that was in Switzerland, that was in the United States. We did that all in one day. And within hours, Nestle was ringing the phones off the hook in all of our offices. We must fix this. What have we done? And they were back in RSPO within 2 weeks. And it showed me how easily you can move a company. I mean, I've got pretty good faith in the media anyway, but you could turn a company that quickly into abiding by what it needs to do through the fear of public change and public opinion. You can't just go to Unilever and say, do better. They've got huge programs for corporate social responsibility. Coca-Cola has the same thing. But Coca-Cola still makes plastic bottles, and they always say, well, the public doesn't want glass bottles, or it's too hard to make them. Really? Because you used to. I'm pretty sure you used to make glass bottles, and that we were all fine with that. Companies are largely lazy, and until they are driven by economic pressure, not political pressure usually, but economic, which is consumer pressure, they will change. And it's a matter of really just recognizing that every choice you make at the store has tremendous political power behind it. Every single choice. And you can make a change. Just the thing you did, or the thing you and your friends did. It doesn't have to be a huge social movement, but you can begin to move that needle yourself.
It's a really great way of putting that.
Yeah, sorry.
It's so easy to forget that your individual actions really do have an effect, a larger effect on society. Let's see. That seems like all the questions in the chat, as well as there's no hands raised, so we can give it another minute if someone's typing up frantically trying to get their last question in.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good.
I was just going to say, if anybody thinks of a question later, if they have concerns, again, my email's right there. Happy to hear from you. Happy to help, and not just today. If you think of it in 2 weeks, I'm always around somewhere. So.
All right. Well, excellent. Thank you so much again for this talk. It was very interesting. It was a different pace from the ones that I've been to, but nonetheless important. And
I talk fast. I talk fast.
It was super interesting. Thank you so much again.
Great.
You're getting a big round of applause in the virtual realm in the corner there.
Great. Well, thank you. I really appreciate the chance to speak at this seminar, and it was a really good bunch to be with. And again, it's great just to make a full circle with Central Washington. So good luck to everybody out there in the work you're doing, the studies you're undertaking. Your passion and your commitment are going to make the difference. So don't let up now. Thanks.
Awesome. Have a good one. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Our next session will be at 11:30.